A world-famous star, seeking peace on a lonely desert road, stops at a quiet diner, only to cross paths with a dangerous gang looking for trouble. He tries to avoid conflict, but when they push too far, they realize too late that the man they underestimated isn't just anyone. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the endless stretch of desert road. Dwayne Johnson, better known to the world as The Rock, sat behind the wheel of his black SUV, the hum of the tires against the asphalt offering a soothing rhythm. This journey wasn't about getting somewhere, it was about getting away. The relentless glare of fame, the cameras, the schedules, the expectations, all of it felt like a weight he couldn't put down. Today he wanted solitude. The road was empty save for the occasional tumbleweed, and a sense of stillness hung in the air. Dwayne relished it. He wasn't The Rock here. He was just a man driving alone under a vast sky, his thoughts his only company. When his eyes caught the flickering neon sign of a diner in the distance, he decided it was time for a break. The place looked like it hadn't changed since the 1970s. A small, unassuming building with peeling paint and a gravel parking lot. It was perfect. He parked his car and stepped inside. The bell above the door jingled, and a few heads turned briefly before returning to their meals. The aroma of frying bacon and coffee greeted him, and for the first time all day, he felt a genuine sense of peace. Choosing a booth by the window, he settled in and ordered a burger and a coffee from the tired-looking waitress. She didn't recognize him, or if she did, she didn't care. A refreshing change. Dwayne stared out at the setting sun as he waited for his food, his mind wandering. The quiet murmur of other diners was a comforting background, their conversations mundane and far removed from the chaos of his world. This was what he needed, a slice of normalcy. But the tranquility didn't last long. The low rumble of motorcycles broke the stillness outside. Moments later, the door burst open, and a group of men stomped in, bringing with them an air of hostility that immediately shifted the atmosphere. 4 of them, dressed in leather jackets and worn jeans, their boots heavy on the linoleum floor. They laughed loudly, their voices grating and intrusive. Leading the pack was a tall, wiry man with sharp features and an unmistakable arrogance about him. He glanced around the diner like he owned it, his gaze lingering on each patron as if daring them to look away. His companions weren't much better, one bulky with a wild beard, another lean with a scar running down his cheek, and the last, younger, with an overconfident smirk. Dwayne kept his eyes on his coffee, his posture relaxed but his senses sharp. He didn't need to cause a scene, he didn't want to. The gang took over a table near the counter, their laughter growing louder, their jokes cruder. The waitress's hands trembled slightly as she approached them. Dwayne noticed but said nothing. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. Yet the leader, Martin, had a knack for spotting the unusual. His eyes swept over Dwayne's broad frame and calm demeanor, something about the man at the booth intriguing him. He exchanged a look with his gang, a smirk forming on his lips. For now, though, Martin decided to leave him alone, focusing instead on his meal. Dwayne exhaled quietly, thankful for the reprieve. But in his gut, he sensed it was temporary. Trouble had a way of finding him, even when he wasn't looking for it. The waitress returned with his burger, her face pale but polite. "Enjoy your meal," she said softly. Dwayne nodded, offering a small smile. He took a bite and focused on the food, grounding himself in the moment. But the uneasy energy in the room remained, like a storm waiting to break. Dwayne focused on his meal, chewing slowly, savoring each bite. The burger was decent, the kind of hearty, no-frills food he had grown to appreciate over the years. But even as he tried to enjoy the moment, he could feel the weight of eyes on him. The gang's presence loomed over the diner, their voices cutting through the low murmur of conversation like a jagged knife. Martin leaned back in his chair, his boots propped up against the edge of the counter, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, Chico," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look at this guy, sitting all quiet, like he owns the place." Chico, the youngest of the group, grinned and leaned in, his dark eyes narrowing. "Yeah, real quiet. Maybe he's one of those yoga types, trying to find his inner peace." The others chuckled, their laughter sharp and mean. Dwayne didn't react. He took another sip of his coffee, keeping his breathing even. He had been through this routine before, provocation, escalation, and inevitable confrontation. But he wasn't here for trouble, not tonight. Lobo, the scar-faced biker, cracked his knuckles and eyed Dwayne's broad shoulders. Or maybe he's just scared, ain't saying a word, hoping we don't notice him. His voice carried a taunt, meant to lure a response. Ramirez, the quietest of the bunch, watched Dwayne with a more calculated gaze. Unlike the others, he wasn't quick to assume, but he didn't speak up either. Martin, sensing the opportunity to stir things up, rose from his seat and sauntered toward Dwayne's booth. Dwayne kept his eyes on his plate, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. He could feel Martin's presence now, standing just a few feet away, radiating that forced bravado of someone used to getting what they wanted. "You're a big guy," Martin said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Real big. Bet you think you're tough, huh?" Dwayne calmly cut another piece of his burger, ignoring the bait. His silence only seemed to fuel Martin's arrogance. Chico snickered. "Come on, man, say something. Ain't polite to ignore folks." Still, Dwayne remained quiet, his expression unreadable. The tension in the diner thickened, other patrons stealing nervous glances before quickly looking away. The waitress, nervously wiping down the counter, avoided eye contact. Martin placed a hand on the back of the booth, leaning in slightly. "What's the matter, amigo? Cat got your tongue?" His breath reeked of beer and cigarettes, the stale scent clinging to the air between them. Dwayne finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting Martin's with a calm intensity that made the biker hesitate for just a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but noticeable. The look in Dwayne's eyes wasn't fear, it was patience, a quiet warning. Lobo, perhaps sensing the shift, stepped closer. "Maybe he's too good to talk to us," he sneered. "Thinks he's better than us." Dwayne set down his fork gently. "I'm just here to eat," he said, his voice low and even, devoid of any aggression. "That's all," Martin chuckled, nudging Chico. "Hear that? He's just here to eat." His grin widened, but there was an undercurrent of something else now. Uncertainty. "Well, maybe we want to have a little conversation. Maybe we want to know why a guy like you is all alone out here." Dwayne met his gaze steadily. "I'm not looking for trouble." Chico snorted. "Yeah? Well, trouble might be looking for you." Martin straightened up, dusting off his jacket. "You know what? Enjoy your meal, big guy." He gestured for his crew to follow him back to their table, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. Dwayne exhaled slowly, watching them retreat. He resumed eating, but the calm he had sought was now out of reach. The night had fully settled in by the time Dwayne finished his meal. The diner's neon sign flickered weakly against the darkness, casting a dim red glow across the gravel parking lot. He stepped outside, breathing in the crisp desert air, trying to push the earlier tension aside. He wasn't new to situations like this. Most trouble could be avoided by staying calm, and that's exactly what he intended to do. Sliding into his SUV, he started the engine, the soft rumble filling the quiet night. He glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed the gang still loitering outside, their laughter echoing through the empty lot. Martin leaned against his motorcycle, watching him with a smug expression. Dwayne ignored it and pulled onto the highway, determined to put the diner and the gang behind him. But the reprieve was short-lived. Moments later, the roar of engines filled the air, growing louder as headlights appeared in his side mirrors. The gang's motorcycles swarmed behind him, like a pack of wolves closing in on their prey. Dwayne's jaw tightened, but he kept his hands steady on the wheel, maintaining his speed. Martin's bike pulled up beside him, matching his pace. The leader grinned, tapping the side of his helmet in a mocking salute before revving his engine and pulling ahead, cutting sharply in front of the SUV. Dwayne slowed down, unwilling to take the bait, but the others flanked him on both sides, boxing him in. Chico rode up on the passenger side, flashing a wide, cocky grin as he rapped his knuckles against the window. "Hey, big guy, we're not done with you yet," he shouted over the roar of the bikes. Dwayne didn't respond. He kept his focus on the road, but inside, his patience was wearing thin. Martin signaled his men, and the bikes closed in tighter, forcing Dwayne to slow down further. The SUV crawled to a near stop in the middle of the empty road, the gang surrounding him in a tight circle. Martin dismounted, walking slowly toward the driver's side window, his posture relaxed but predatory. Dwayne rolled the window down slightly, his face calm but firm. "You got a problem?" he asked evenly. Martin smirked. "Yeah, actually, you're on our road, amigo, and we don't let just anyone pass without contributing." He tapped the hood of the SUV lightly. "Consider it a toll." Dwayne sighed, resting his hands on the wheel. Not interested. Martin's expression darkened. See, that's not how it works. You're out here alone, big guy. Nobody to help you. So you're gonna pay up, or things might get difficult. Lobo and Ramirez flanked either side of the vehicle, their faces hard and expectant. Chico leaned against the passenger side mirror, chewing gum loudly. Come on, man, he said. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Dwayne's eyes scanned the road ahead. There was nothing but darkness and silence stretching for miles. He could handle this, but he didn't want to escalate the situation. Not yet. Look, Dwayne said, his voice steady. I don't want trouble. I'll turn around, go another way. No problem. Martin laughed, a low, condescending sound. Nah, that's not how it works, pal. You see, we decide who passes and who doesn't. He leaned in closer, his tone growing more threatening. And tonight you're not going anywhere unless you pay your dues. Dwayne studied Martin for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. He could see where this was headed, and he was getting tired of playing along. You should rethink that, he said quietly. Martin's smirk faltered for just a second before he regained his composure. Tough guy, huh? He stepped back, snapping his fingers. All right, boys, let's see what he's really made of. The bikes revved louder, their engines growling in unison. Dwayne's grip on the wheel tightened, his jaw clenching as he prepared for what was coming next. Dwayne took a deep breath, his fingers curling around the steering wheel as the motorcycles idled around him like circling predators. The desert air was thick with tension, and the flickering headlights cast long, eerie shadows across the cracked asphalt. Martin stood confidently in front of the SUV, arms crossed, waiting for a reaction. But Dwayne didn't move. Instead, he calmly turned off the ignition, letting the silence stretch between them. He opened the door slowly, stepping out with deliberate ease. The gang's laughter faded as they watched him, their cocky expression shifting ever so slightly. He stood tall under the night sky, his broad frame imposing without effort. His face remained composed, but his eyes held an unmistakable weight, steady, unshaken, and utterly unreadable. Martin tilted his head, clearly unimpressed. You think stepping out changes anything, big guy? He sneered, motioning toward Chico. My boy here doesn't take kindly to guys who don't show respect. Chico, full of bravado, stepped forward with a swagger, cracking his knuckles. Yeah, man, you're acting like you're in control. He jabbed a finger toward Dwayne's chest. But out here, we make the rules. Dwayne didn't flinch. He simply stared at Chico, his expression as immovable as stone. The young biker shifted slightly under the weight of that gaze, but pride kept him from backing down. He pushed further, stepping closer. You got something to say, big man? Without a word, Dwayne took a single step to the side, the movement subtle but commanding. The air around them shifted. Chico hesitated, confused for a split second, but the message was clear. Back off, or find out. Martin chuckled darkly, sensing the unease creeping into his friend's stance. Come on, Chico. Show him what happens to tough guys out here. Chico clenched his fists, but before he could make a move, Dwayne's eyes locked onto his with such intensity that it rooted him to the spot. A silent warning. No bravado, no threats, just the kind of quiet authority that couldn't be faked. Ramirez, watching from the sidelines, narrowed his eyes. He had seen plenty of men try to bluff their way through a confrontation, but this was something different. Dwayne wasn't posturing, he wasn't afraid, and that made him dangerous. Chico shifted uncomfortably, but forced a laugh. What? You think you're some kind of tough guy? He said, trying to mask his doubt. Dwayne still said nothing. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just enough to make his point. Chico finally took a step back, feigning disinterest. Whatever, man, you're not worth it. Martin frowned, sensing that control of the situation was slipping. He wasn't used to people standing their ground without fear, and it was starting to irritate him. All right, enough games, he growled. You're not leaving here until I say so. Dwayne, still composed, met Martin's gaze. His voice was calm but laced with quiet authority. You don't want to do this. Martin laughed, but it lacked its earlier confidence. And why's that? Dwayne didn't answer. Instead, he took another step forward, his sheer presence forcing Martin to instinctively adjust his stance. It was a small thing, but Martin knew it. And more importantly, so did his men. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then Lobo muttered under his breath, Maybe we should just let him go, man. Martin shot him a glare, but the seed of doubt had been planted. He was losing his grip and he knew it. Dwayne held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to his SUV, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He got in, started the engine, and waited. Martin stood frozen, his pride warring with logic. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped aside, signaling his men to move. Dwayne nodded once and drove off, leaving the gang standing in the dust, the weight of his silent warning hanging heavy in the air. As the roar of the SUV faded into the distance, Martin stood still, his jaw clenched in frustration. The gang had never encountered someone like that before, silent, composed, and completely unshaken. There was something about him that didn't sit right. He wasn't scared. He wasn't angry. He was in control. Ramirez, standing slightly apart from the others, watched the taillights disappear over the horizon. His instincts told him that Martin had just made a serious mistake. "Hey, boss," he said cautiously. "You sure we should be messing with that guy?" Martin shot him an irritated glance. "What are you talking about? He's just some musclehead trying to act tough. We've dealt with plenty like him before." Ramirez shook his head. "No, man. He didn't even flinch. Most guys would have backed down or started running their mouths. But him? He didn't say much, didn't need to." His voice dropped slightly. "Guys like that, they're dangerous." Lobo, who had been quiet up until now, rubbed the back of his neck uneasily. "Yeah, I got a bad feeling about him too." "Didn't feel right, Martin." Martin scoffed, unwilling to let his authority be questioned. "You two sound like scared little kids." He turned to Chico, his most impulsive and reckless member. "What do you think?" Chico, still nursing his bruised pride from the silent encounter, spat on the ground. "I think he's just another chump. We should have taught him a lesson right there." He grinned, trying to mask his earlier hesitation. "Let's go after him. Show him what happens when you disrespect us." Martin seemed to like that idea, his frustration melting into a more familiar arrogance. "Damn right," he said, swinging a leg over his bike. "Let's finish this." But Ramirez wasn't convinced. He stayed where he was, watching the road ahead. Something about that man was gnawing at him. He'd seen plenty of tough guys come and go, but this was different. There was an eerie stillness about him, the kind of quiet confidence that only came from experience, serious experience. As the bikes roared to life, Ramirez pulled out his phone, curiosity pushing him to dig deeper. He typed in a quick description: tall, bald, built like a tank, black SUV. The search results populated quickly, and when he scrolled down, his stomach tightened. Photos and headlines flooded the screen. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Hollywood superstar, former pro wrestler, former football player, former law enforcement. His eyes widened as he read further. Reports of military-style training, intense stunt work, and a reputation for being one of the most disciplined and formidable men in the industry. Ramirez swallowed hard. "Martin," he called out, his voice urgent. Martin, already halfway onto the highway, rolled his eyes. "What now?" Ramirez held up his phone. "You might want to take a look at this." Martin snatched the phone, skimming the headlines. His eyes narrowed, but he forced a laugh. "So what? He's an actor, man. All show, no go." He tossed the phone back, but Ramirez could see it, the brief flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Boss, listen to me," Ramirez pressed. "This guy isn't just some wannabe tough guy. He's the real deal. We mess with him, we might not walk away from it." Chico, oblivious to the weight of the revelation, revved his engine impatiently. "We gonna sit here talking, or are we gonna take care of business?" Martin hesitated, his pride warring with the growing unease gnawing at him. The smart move was to back off, but pride had never been his strong suit. "Let's ride," he said through clenched teeth, his ego refusing to let it go. Ramirez sighed, knowing that Martin was making a mistake. But deep down, a part of him was curious. Just how dangerous was this man they had chosen to mess with? As they sped off into the night, their headlights cutting through the darkness, Ramirez couldn't shake the feeling that they were riding straight into something far bigger than they could handle. The roar of the motorcycles echoed through the empty desert highway, their headlights carving jagged beams through the darkness. Martin led the charge, his jaw tight with determination, his mind racing with thoughts of regaining control. Behind him, Chico, Lobo, and Ramirez followed, their engines growling like hungry predators. Dwayne's SUV loomed ahead in the distance, its taillights glowing red in the night. He could see them coming, but he didn't speed up. Instead, he maintained his steady pace, his hands relaxed on the wheel. He had been in situations like this before. Men who thought intimidation and numbers gave them the upper hand. They were about to learn the hard way that strength wasn't about size or aggression. Martin pulled up alongside the SUV, signaling to Chico and Lobo to flank the other side. Dwayne could feel the tension building as they boxed him in once again. Chico revved his engine aggressively, shouting over the roar, "Hey, big guy, time to pay up!" Dwayne exhaled through his nose, his patience hanging by a thread. He slowed down even further, forcing the bikers to adjust their speed. Martin, sensing an opportunity, pulled in front of him, forcing him to a stop. The desert stretched around them, silent and vast. Dwayne sat in the SUV for a moment, staring at the men now surrounding him. He didn't like where this was going, but he had given them enough chances to walk away. With a deep breath, he shut off the engine and stepped out. The gang watched him carefully, their confidence wavering despite their numbers. Even in the dim light, Dwayne's sheer presence was enough to make them uneasy. He stood tall, his expression calm but commanding. Martin sneered, masking his growing uncertainty. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, amigo," he said, stepping closer. "We've been real patient." Dwayne's eyes locked onto Martin's, his voice steady and low. "I told you, I don't want trouble." Martin smirked. "Yeah? Well, you got it." He barely had time to finish the sentence before Lobo lunged, a sudden reckless move meant to catch Dwayne off guard, but it didn't. In a blur of motion, Dwayne sidestepped, grabbing Lobo's wrist mid-swing and twisting it effortlessly. The biker let out a surprised yelp as he was spun around and slammed into the hood of the SUV, his face pressing against the cold metal. Chico took a step forward, fists clenched, but Dwayne's eyes snapped to him, freezing him in place. The silent warning was enough to make him reconsider. Dwayne released Lobo, who staggered back, clutching his arm and gasping for breath. "What the hell?" he muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Martin's bravado cracked. He had expected a fight, not precision, not control. He glanced at Ramirez, who stood still, watching with an expression that said, "I told you so." "You still think this is a good idea?" Dwayne asked, his voice measured but firm. Martin hesitated. His pride screamed at him to push forward, but his instincts, the ones he usually ignored, were telling him to back off. Chico, however, wasn't ready to let it go. "You think you're some kind of superhero?" he spat, stepping forward again. Dwayne didn't answer. Instead, he took a deliberate step toward Chico. The biker, for all his bravado, faltered, his fists trembling slightly. Martin saw it. They all saw it. The balance of power had shifted. Ramirez finally spoke up. "Martin, let's walk away, man." His voice was quiet but firm. "This guy isn't who we thought he was." Martin clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. He had a reputation to uphold. But tonight, his pride had led them straight into something they weren't prepared for. Dwayne's voice broke the silence. "Go home. Find a better way." For the first time, Martin had no comeback. He looked at his crew, Lobo nursing his wrist, Chico's eyes darting nervously, and Ramirez standing firm in quiet understanding. With a scowl, Martin stepped back and gestured to his bike. "Let's get out of here." Chico hesitated but followed. Lobo didn't need convincing. Ramirez lingered for a moment, meeting Dwayne's gaze with a nod of respect before climbing onto his bike. Dwayne watched them disappear down the highway, his stance still firm, his heart steady. Strength wasn't about showing off. It was about knowing when to stand, when to speak, and when to let go. As he climbed back into his SUV, he knew this wasn't over. Martin's pride was a dangerous thing. But for now, the road was his again, stretching endlessly into the desert night. The rhythmic hum of the SUV's tires against the asphalt was a stark contrast to the chaotic thoughts racing through Martin's mind. The gang had ridden off in silence, but the bitter taste of humiliation lingered. His grip on the handlebars tightened, his knuckles whitening under the leather gloves. He had never been made to look weak before, and he wasn't about to let it slide. "Boss," Ramirez called over the wind as they rode. "Let it go. We're lucky we walked away in one piece." Martin didn't respond. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed ahead on the road. But inside, his pride was screaming. He had to prove he was still in control. Without warning, he signaled the others and veered off the highway onto a narrow dirt road leading back toward the main route. Chico and Lobo followed without question, but Ramirez hesitated before reluctantly falling in line. Dwayne saw the glimmer of headlights reappearing in his rearview mirror, growing closer. He sighed, shaking his head. They never learn. Slowing his SUV to a crawl, he pulled off onto a quiet stretch of road, stepping out once again into the desert night. The gang rolled to a stop a short distance away, their silhouettes looming under the moonlight. Martin dismounted first, his eyes blazing with defiance. "You think you can just walk away?" he spat, stepping forward. "No one makes a fool out of me." Dwayne crossed his arms, his voice calm. "You did that all on your own." Chico snickered at the remark, but quickly bit his tongue when Martin shot him a glare. Martin clenched his fists, his body tense with rage. "You think you're better than us?" he growled. Dwayne didn't flinch. "No, I just know what fights are worth having. This isn't one of them." But Martin was beyond reason. He lunged forward, swinging wildly. Dwayne sidestepped effortlessly, his movements precise and controlled. With a swift, fluid motion, he caught Martin's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him down to his knees. "You're angry," Dwayne said quietly. "But anger doesn't win fights. Control does." Martin struggled, breathing hard, but Dwayne didn't tighten his grip. He didn't need to. The message was clear. "You done?" Dwayne asked, his voice steady. Chico and Lobo shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. Ramirez, however, took a step forward. "Martin, stop. You're not going to win this." Martin's breath was ragged, his pride torn apart. After a long, tense moment, he grunted and Dwayne released him, stepping back. Martin stumbled to his feet, glaring but saying nothing. Dwayne watched him closely. "You've got a choice," he said. "Keep going down this road or walk away and figure out something better." Martin's face twisted with conflicting emotions, humiliation, anger, and something else. Doubt. He looked at his gang, their faces expectant, waiting for him to lead. But for the first time, he didn't have an answer. Ramirez stepped beside him, his voice calm but firm. "He's right, man. This isn't the way." Martin's eyes darted between Ramirez and Dwayne, then back to his men. He could see the cracks forming in their loyalty. With a frustrated growl, he turned away and climbed onto his bike. "Let's get out of here," he muttered. Chico and Lobo hesitated, but eventually followed suit, kicking up dust as they rode off into the night. Ramirez lingered a moment longer, nodding toward Dwayne. "You got a point, man," he said. "Not sure he's ready to hear it, though." Dwayne nodded. "Maybe not today, but he will." With that, Ramirez turned and rode off after the others, disappearing into the darkness. Dwayne stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle once more. He had faced bigger fights in his life, but the toughest battles were often the ones that didn't require fists. Sliding back into his SUV, he started the engine and drove on, the open road stretching ahead, endless and full of possibilities. The desert wind howled softly through the night as the gang rode in silence, the hum of their engines no longer carrying the same confidence as before. Ramirez kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was elsewhere. The confrontation with Dwayne had shaken him, not just because of the man's strength, but because of the way he carried himself, calm, controlled, unwavering. It was something Ramirez hadn't seen in a long time, if ever. He glanced sideways at Martin, who was gripping the handlebars tightly, his face twisted in frustration. Martin had always been the tough one, the leader, but tonight, something had shifted. The cracks in his armor were starting to show. Chico, always the loudest, finally broke the silence. "Man, I can't believe we just let that guy walk. We should have taken him down." Lobo scoffed, rubbing his wrist where Dwayne had subdued him earlier. "Yeah? You want to go back and try again? Be my guest." Martin, riding ahead, clenched his teeth but said nothing. He wasn't used to backing down, and it was eating him alive. He had built his reputation on being untouchable, and tonight that illusion had been shattered. Ramirez sighed. "Maybe it's time we think about what we're doing," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That guy, he didn't fight because he didn't have to. He knew we weren't worth it." Chico rolled his eyes. "Here we go. Getting all philosophical on us, Ramirez?" Lobo, however, seemed to consider it. "Nah, he's got a point. We keep pushing guys like him. Eventually, we're gonna push the wrong one." Martin finally spoke, his voice sharp. "We're not walking away. Not from him. Not from anything. You hear me?" Ramirez shook his head. "And then what, Martin? We keep doing this? Pushing people around until someone pushes back harder? What's the end game here?" Martin glared at him through the rearview mirror of his bike. "You don't like it? Then leave." Ramirez looked away, the words stinging more than they should have. He had been with the gang for years following Martin's lead, but tonight doubt gnawed at him like never before. Seeing Dwayne handle them so effortlessly made him realize how small their world really was. They weren't untouchable. They were just bullies riding through an empty desert, picking fights they couldn't win. "I'm just saying," Ramirez muttered. "Maybe it's time to think about something else." "A way out." Chico laughed bitterly. "Out to what? A desk job? Man, we're not built for that life." Ramirez stayed quiet, but deep down, he wasn't so sure anymore. Lobo nudged him lightly with his elbow. "You thinking about leaving, hermano?" Ramirez hesitated before answering. "I don't know. Maybe?" Martin overheard and slammed his brakes, causing the others to swerve to avoid him. He turned his bike sharply, facing Ramirez with a look of disbelief and fury. "You're serious? After everything we've been through?" Ramirez met his gaze without flinching. "Look, man, I'm tired. Tired of scraping by. Tired of looking over my shoulder. And tonight showed me something. We're not as tough as we think we are." Martin's fists clenched, but before he could respond, Lobo cut in. "Ramirez has a point. Maybe it's time to think bigger, Martin. We can't keep running these roads forever." Martin's face darkened, his pride boiling over. "You want to run? Go ahead, but I'm not done." His eyes burned with resentment, not just toward Dwayne, but toward the cracks forming within his own crew. Ramirez exhaled slowly. "Maybe I will," he said, his voice steady. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life chasing ghosts." Martin didn't reply. Instead, he revved his engine and took off into the night, leaving the others staring after him. Ramirez looked at Lobo and Chico. "I think I'm done," he said simply. Lobo nodded slowly. Chico hesitated but eventually sighed. "Man, I don't know." Ramirez smiled faintly. "Think about it." As they rode back onto the highway, the weight of the night sat heavy on all of them. Change was coming, whether they were ready or not. Martin rode hard and fast, the wind tearing at his face, but the thoughts racing through his mind were even louder. His grip on the handlebars was tight, his knuckles white beneath his gloves. The road ahead stretched endlessly, yet he felt like he was going nowhere. He had always been the leader, the one in control. His crew followed him without question, until tonight. Tonight, everything had changed. The look in Ramirez's eyes, the way Lobo hesitated, even Chico's silence. It was all eating at him. And it was all because of that man, Dwayne Johnson. Martin growled under his breath, the mere thought of him stoking the fire of his frustration. He should have handled him back at the diner, ended it before it got out of hand. But no, he let it get to this point. Let doubt creep into his crew. Let fear worm its way into his own thoughts. His pride burned hotter than ever. Slowing his bike, he pulled over to the side of the road, dust swirling around him. The desert stretched out in every direction, silent and empty. He swung his leg over the bike and paced, running a hand through his hair, breathing heavily. "Damn it," he muttered. In the distance, the faint growl of engines signaled the approach of the others. Ramirez, Lobo, and Chico rolled to a stop beside him, their expressions cautious but expectant. Ramirez was the first to speak. "Martin, look, man, you don't have to prove anything." Martin turned sharply, his eyes blazing. "I built this, Ramirez. You think I'm gonna just walk away?" "No one's asking you to," Ramirez said, his voice steady. "But maybe it's time to think about what we're doing. Is this all there is? Running down strangers, picking fights? What's the end game here?" Martin shook his head, pacing again. "You don't get it. You've never had to be in charge. I can't just walk away. He paused, struggling for words. "I've got a reputation." Lobo stepped forward, rubbing his arm where Dwayne had twisted it earlier. "Yeah, but a reputation for what, boss? Getting beat by some guy who didn't even have to throw a punch?" Martin's eyes snapped to him, his jaw tightening. "You saying I should let it go?" "I'm saying," Lobo continued carefully, "maybe it's time to figure out what we really want. Because I don't want to end up like some low-life thug, Martin, and I don't think you do either." Chico, usually the loudest, finally spoke up, his voice quieter than usual. "He's right, man. We've been doing this for years, but where's it getting us?" Martin looked at his crew, the same guys he had ridden with for so long, now questioning everything. The old Martin would have snapped, told them to shut up and ride. But tonight, things were different. That encounter with Dwayne had shown him something. Strength wasn't just about muscle. It was about knowing when to stand your ground and when to let go. Martin exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging ever so slightly. "You guys really want out?" he asked, his voice quieter, more vulnerable than they had ever heard. Ramirez nodded. "Yeah, man, I do. I want something more than this." Lobo nodded too. Chico hesitated, then shrugged. Guess I could figure something else out. Martin looked down at his bike, his mind swirling with thoughts of the life he had built and the life he might still have ahead of him. Leaving behind everything he had known seemed impossible, but staying meant an endless cycle, one he was no longer sure he could keep up with. Finally, he looked back at them and gave a slow nod. "All right," he said. "Maybe it's time." Ramirez smiled, relief washing over his face. "We'll figure it out, Martin. Together." Martin took one last glance at the dark road ahead, then swung his leg over his bike. "Let's go," he said, his voice lighter than it had been in a long time. As they rode into the night, Martin felt something lift off his shoulders. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning of something better. The gang rode in silence, the desert wind cool against their faces. For the first time in years, Martin felt something he couldn't quite name: relief. The weight of his pride, his reputation, all the things that had chained him to this life, seemed lighter with each passing mile. Ramirez rode beside him, a small, knowing smile on his face. "Didn't think I'd see the day," he said over the roar of the engines. Martin smirked, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, maybe it's time for a change." As they pulled into a quiet roadside stop, they parked their bikes and sat on the curb, watching the distant headlights of cars moving towards something bigger, something better. "What now?" Chico asked, his voice hesitant but hopeful. Martin exhaled, looking up at the stars. "We start over, no more stupid fights, no more running." A deep rumble interrupted their thoughts as an SUV rolled past. Inside, Dwayne gave them a brief nod, an unspoken understanding passing between him and Martin. No words were needed. As the SUV disappeared into the night, Martin stood up, dusted off his jacket, and smiled. "Let's ride, on our own terms." And with that, they set off into a new beginning. True strength isn't just about muscles or intimidation. It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. In a world where power is often mistaken for dominance, real courage comes from self-control, wisdom, and the ability to choose a better path. What would you have done in Dwayne's shoes? Would you have stayed calm or let pride take over? Click the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and see how small choices can lead to big changes.